Hello, this is Paul Frazier again from Western Ohio Bigfoot Research, and I'm excited tonight to have Russell Easterbrooks with me tonight. He's been a friend of mine for a while. We've talked some, but it's going to be nice to have him here for a show to actually really get to talk to him one on one. So, to start out with, Russell, if I'm not mistaken, you were a park ranger at one time. So, could you just go ahead and tell us about who you are and how you got interested in Bigfoot?
Okay. Thank you for having me on your show. I appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Um, yeah, I worked with the North Carolina Forest Service for a while. Did a
In
lot of
Uari or
chainsaw. What's that?
Uari or
No, over in the Smokies,
oh, okay.
over near there. And I did a lot of chainsaw work for them. And then I also worked for Vermont State Parks and the forestry department in Vermont. So um, I did took a test for a deputy warden, and I did some of that as well in Vermont. I got started in Bigfoot writing a high school report, and it got a lot of laughs, and
Would that have
everybody was
been close?
quite amused about it. But I did really well with it, and that was kind of my start. And so I did a lot of research at the time, and there weren't a lot of books out there. John Green stuff was available, and
Yeah.
um, there was a few others, Grover Krantz, but there wasn't much out there to work with. But that's how I first got started, and that got me interested in it. And then I've been working with it on and off over my life and working around work and other things. And I have Parkinson's disease, so that's why I have a hard time sitting still sometimes.
That's okay. Did you have any experiences while you were out working in the forest industry or
No, I found we got a good footprint casting. That's all. I've never had a sighting, um, which is a little disappointing, but
me
that's
neither?
John Green, and there was plenty of others who never had a sighting. So,
That's true.
but
Well, when you did your report, how close was that to the Patterson Gimlin film coming out?
my report was done in '74.
Okay, so
Yep. So
seven
that was
years.
after that. So I talked about that briefly, but I where I lived, it was kind of out in the boonies, and it was a real small high school. I only had 40 people in my senior class, so
Yeah,
it
I
was
had
a real
80,
small
so yeah, not
school.
much bigger.
Yeah, and but it was interesting. I got a good grade on it, and I think a lot of people um, kind of opened their eyes a little bit to it, and because it realized it wasn't really a joke, and that's kind of the double-edged sword with the whole Sasquatch Bigfoot phenomenon, because you know they're used in advertising and stuff for beef jerky and automobile
Yeah,
sales and all kinds of
yeah.
things, and so it's a lot of times it's hard to get um, a really serious uh, discussion going on it, because so many people do kind of laugh it off a little bit,
Well, I
but
think it's getting more and more acceptance with some of the shows coming out. Like the
absolutely, yeah, yeah.
Finding Bigfoot and
Uh,
Expedition Bigfoot,
Leonard Nimoy, that was a big one when that came out, and they
Six
started
Million
talking
Dollar
about
Man.
that. That was a good
Six,
one.
yeah,
The um, Sierra Sounds,
yeah.
with the once that got started with Ron Moorhead, and that out there, that brought some more factual type of information towards the subject too. So
Well, I've told people, I don't know if you had this experience, but I remember as a kid, I was 4 years old when Patterson Gimlin came out, and in sometime in the early 70s. I couldn't tell you what year or even what movie for that matter, but I remember going to the theater with my mom and dad to see some movie, probably a Disney movie. And before the movie, they showed the Patterson Gimlin film at the
Oh,
theater.
yeah,
Yeah, it
yeah,
was a big deal back then.
yeah. And then a lot of people didn't know what to make of it,
Yeah,
because they, whether, you know, to what to believe in it. Was this made up, or was this, real, or so a lot of people kind of took it as tongue in cheek. But at the time, the Russians were the ones who really put a lot of effort into it early on.
yeah,
Um, when I believe it was Rahe Gehinden who took the tape to Russia, and they really did a lot of work on it. When in this country we were kind of a little bit behind on the effort that was put into looking at it. Well, we have since caught up, obviously, but
yeah.
but early on, the Russians were the ones who really found that piece of tape most interesting.
And remember, Tom Slick sent
Yep.
Peter Byrne to Tibet to look for the Yeti, which
Yep.
is when I saw the Patterson Gimlin film as a kid. I shortly after read that book, The Yeti, and that's what I always associated as. It was a Yeti that was living in our country, and I never thought there was more than one at that point. Just being dumb and not knowing, but and I sure would have never thought they'd be in Ohio or in Vermont or North Carolina or anywhere else. But
Right.
I've learned a
Everybody
lot.
thought it was just California when the Patterson Gimlin film came out, and
Yeah,
and and then there were some sighting reports and stuff from that area. John Green had taken some reports, and the whole Osterman encounter, which is a fantastic encounter, and certainly I've studied that probably more than any encounter out there. Although Ernie's account is very good as well, and has a lot of
yeah,
some
yeah,
similarities with actually seeing two Sasquatch speak to each other. I mean, that's pretty rare in accounts today, but we saw that in Osterman, and we saw that in Ernie's account as well. So,
yeah.
um,
Well, for those that there may be people that don't know about Osterman. Let's go ahead and talk about that. That Albert Osterman.
yep, yeah, Osterman was very interesting because his encounter took place in the 20s, and he was supposedly picked up by a Sasquatch in his sleeping bag and carried off to what he believed was like an encampment that the Sasquatch was in. There was a male, a female, and two adolescents there. And he thought it
Mm-hmm.
was just a stopover place or something that they came to. He didn't think it was someplace that they lived for a long period of time, but they kept him there for probably, I think it was like 4 days, and wouldn't let him leave. He was kind of like a box canyon, only a little bit smaller. There was a small stream there, and coming out of the mountain, and so there was water there. But they, it was difficult for him to have to try to climb up the ledges to try to escape. So obviously he didn't, and he stayed there for about 4 days until he finally did get away.
Didn't John Green interview him?
Yes, John Green interviewed him
Yeah,
extensively and was a very close friend of his after that for many years until Osterman passed away. Um, and the account is anybody who's interested in Sasquatch should look into that account and go through the fine details of it, because that's the stuff that makes this account so interesting.
yeah. A
Um,
lot of detail that he gave.
right, and he was very detailed in what when he did his explained his account to John Green, and John Green was a newspaper man, and so he knew how to take down information and everything, and he was
Yeah.
very specific when he asked these questions and got this. And Osterman was specific in giving him answers. So, um,
But didn't Osterman kind of theorize that this Sasquatch had got him to hook him up with his daughter?
yeah,
The
that was one
female?
thought. I mean,
Yeah.
Osterman couldn't understand why the Sasquatch picked him up and carried him and brought him back to the encampment. Now, that was one
Yeah.
theory that they thought that maybe he was brought back for that purpose, but
Yeah.
it's kind of unknown for sure. But
Yeah,
there's
it was just a
other things
guess.
that are interesting about that. Osterman was picked up in the sleeping bag, and he couldn't get out of the sleeping bag. Obviously, he was kind of all scrunched up inside of it, and the
Yeah.
Sasquatch carried him for a distance. We don't know exactly. He estimated it was a few miles.
Mm-hmm.
But the Sasquatch, when he picked him up and was taking him away back to his encampment, he also picked up Osterman's backpack, which had his cans and his other food in it. So I found that very interesting that not only did he pick up Osterman, but he picked up his food too, because he must have felt that Osterman was going to need that food to stay alive.
Or he wanted it for himself. Knew it was food.
Yeah. Well, he had been around the Osterman's encampment the night before, because there was some things rearranged in his encampment. So, and he did. The Sasquatch did take some flour and some other things, but I think he took it because he wanted to have the food for Osterman to keep him alive.
Could be.
That's what I think.
But me and Ernie was talking about it the other day, and I don't know if you're familiar with Randy. Out there out there to 400, where they had lost a walkie-talkie, and
Yep.
it showed up. It showed up on the trail, and I've heard other instances where people have lost things, and it shows up, and it's like they know, for whatever reason, maybe this is valuable to us, so they, like you said, maybe with Osterman, he got it because he thought, well, this is something he would need or want, so he brought it along.
Right.
Possibly.
And that's what I think too. I think he did it for that purpose. And of course, once Osterman was in the encampment, he was able to go through this pack, and he was able to. He had matches. He made a little fire. He got some water from the stream that was bubbling right there close by, and made coffee. And so he was lucky. He had that stuff right there with him. He had his gun, his rifle as well, but his rifle was down in his sleeping bag, and along with his hunting knife and stuff. So he couldn't get at that very well because he was all scrunched up and sitting kind of really an uncomfortable position. Because he said once the Sasquatch dropped him on the ground and he crawled out of the sleeping bag, he was so stiff and he couldn't even straighten his legs out for quite a while. So,
well, I'm assuming you talk about that in your book, don't you?
I do. Yeah, I talk about the Osterman case and that encounter quite a bit, because there's a number of things in there that I highlight that are very interesting. Osterman saw the family of Sasquatch speaking to each other, and he called it a chatter talk. That's what he called it, a chatter talk. Yeah. And they actually spoke to each other with this chatter talk. And today that's what we call it. We call it the chatter. Because that's what it sounds like. And so it's interesting that Osterman used that same term. And then the other interesting thing about that, when Osterman tried to leave the area, the Sasquatch stood in front of him and held his hands out like the stop signal and said a single word. It sounded like Soka or something like that. He didn't use the chatter talk that he was using to talk to his family. He used just a single word and a stop and a hand signal to try to get to Osterman to stay where he was and go back and where his pack was. So I found that very interesting. Certainly, it's like a sign language, but to use just that one word, that was a conscious thought process on that Sasquatch's part to use a word that he thought Osterman would understand. Now, Osterman didn't understand what the word was, but
have you
but he
found that
knew,
word?
But the Sasquatch knew that chatter talk would not be something he would understand.
Have you found that word in any Native American languages?
No, and I have sure looked too, but yeah, I've looked a long time for that, trying to find it. Now, all I have is Osterman's, how he heard the word. He said it sounded like soca, and then it could be spelled any number of different ways. There's one word in that was similar that I found, but it wasn't the same. So far I haven't. I expected it would be Native American, but I haven't found anything like it. So.
Well, I'm trying to remember
the word that in his work of listening to the Sierra sounds that he had in his paperwork on what he looked into the sounds of the Sierra sounds, and the word he found was similar to it, but it wasn't the same. But
well, you got me curious now because it sounds somewhat. I'm trying to remember what the word is. Are you familiar with Henry? I think it's Franzioni. Is that how you say his name? You know who I'm talking about? He was on the Sasquatch Flash of Beauty. He was on that.
I'm not familiar with that. No.
Let me see if I can find, because he wrote a book, and the book was based on Native American references to Sasquatch. And one of the things he did is he went through, like mainly out west, but he went through all these areas where something was called like Devil Lake or Skookum Lake, any of those terms that might be a reference to Sasquatch at some time, and to try to find all those areas. And I can't remember the name of his book, but that name or the word Soka, it's similar. I'm trying to remember what the name of his book is.
Oh, wow.
I got to look that up. I'll see if I can find that. Anyway, while we're talking about it, let's go ahead and, why don't you go ahead and mention your book? Let me bring that back up.
Yeah, I talk about Osterman extensively in my book, and some of the similarities with Ernie's account. He saw two Sasquatch speaking to each other in chatter talk. He saw sign language. There were some other things that were similar. And Osterman was well before his time. Now, he didn't give his report to John Green until later, but it happened in the 20s. So it's like it's very early. So it's definitely a really viable report. And it's like based on some of the things that he talked about and what we know about today.
Well, with Ernie's account, he saw them do sign language. He saw them do a whoop. He actually saw them do the whistle.
A whistle.
So there's several things there.
And they did the chatter talk to each other.
Yeah, the talk.
And he saw when they did the whoop, he saw them put their hands up around their mouth to do that. He saw that as well. So the sign language that's definitely what it was. I mean, there's no question that he was trying to communicate with Ernie, and the same thing was with Osterman. When Osterman was trying to leave, the Sasquatch was trying to communicate with him, giving him the stop sign. It's like, no, stay back, and say that one word that sounded like Soka. So,
well, let me look here real quick while we're here on Amazon. Let me look him up real quick, see if his book comes up. It's Henry
Okay.
Franzoni is his. I don't know if I'm saying it right, but that's his name. Let's see if we can find his book.
But I talk about a lot of things in my book. I try to focus on the history
A
of
lot of historical.
right, the
Yeah.
historical aspect of what was going on at the time and how that would have affected a Sasquatch in the area. Obviously, we're talking about the gold rush in California, and then it moved up the coast to British Columbia, and then it moved to Alaska. And in each of those areas, there were large amounts of people that were suddenly flooded into the wilderness. There were towns built. There was a tremendous amount of logging going on. So they actually cut down almost every tree and sawed them up to boards to make shacks and buildings and stuff. So all of this followed the gold rush and had to have had an effect on Sasquatch that was living in those areas. He would have got pushed out of those areas for certain. So that's a really interesting, and that's why I tried to highlight a lot of that in my book. I also spoke in great detail about the Hudson Bay Company because they were in Canada very early. We're talking 1630s, something like that. And of course, these hunters and trappers were collecting furs and stuff, and there were a number of accounts, not too well known, other than David Thompson's. His is the most well known one, where he found the footprints. But there were some other reports that I found that were in the Hudson Bay records that was speaking of a wild man that was seen and in different parts of British Columbia in particular, but also in Saskatchewan and other areas that had Hudson Bay posts. So that's another area that I spent a lot of time looking at and looking for references to accounts. The oldest account I found was in around the 1750s, where a wild man was on board a ship and was being transported to England to be given to Count Buffon. Now, Count Buffon, if you look into some of his history, he wrote a number of books on animals, wildlife, birds, like a book like what Audubon would do today. Listing different birds and their colors and their size and so forth. Well, he did a lot of mammals and animals as well. And he was supposed to get this wild man. And the wild man was, they described him in the newspaper clipping as being over 7 feet tall, with large feet. It's just an interesting report for that early on. And then it's kind of lost. I couldn't find out until later. I found out some more information where it was held in Ireland for a short period of time. And I believe it passed away there. It probably got some kind of disease, a European disease. Those diseases were brought to North America first in 1792, smallpox, and it devastated the Native American tribes. And then again during the gold rush in the 1860s. So it could have been something like that could have led to this wild man's demise. So he only lived for a short period of time. But that was an interesting newspaper clipping.
Did they seem to think of it as an animal or more of a feral human?
They thought it was more of a feral human. They said it would drink from a cup, which was interesting. I mean, that takes hand-eye coordination to be able to do that.
Right.
We see that in Osterman's account, where the Sasquatch picks up
Tried the
Osterman's
coffee.
coffee mug,
Yeah.
a coffee container, and puts it up to his mouth and drinks out of it. Osterman also made, he would take tin cans that his canned milk came in, and he would make a hole in it and put a stick through it to make a dipping cup. So he could dip it into a little pool of water and drink out of it. And he showed it, he made one and showed it to the one of the adolescents, and gave it to him. And the young juvenile went over to the old man and showed him the cup and drank out of it, and like Osterman showed him. And then the juvenile came back to Osterman and pointed, there again, sign language. This is the juvenile now, points to the cup that Osterman just made for him. And then he pointed to his sister. He wanted Osterman to make a cup for his sister as well. That's what Osterman, recognized it as.
Yeah.
And that's very interesting as well. So,
yeah.
But yeah, so that's probably what happened. And in North America, it's very likely that the Sasquatch population it would have for sure been affected by the gold rush, the logging, and all of that. Well, it would make sense that the smallpox could have certainly damaged their population in that part of the country as well. So,
well, something I found out, which, in that same vein, you'll probably find interesting, is I went down to southern part of Ohio. There's iron furnaces down in that area from the 1800s. And I didn't realize it, but Ohio was like a major iron industry back in the 1800s. And if you're interested, or anybody that's watching is interested, there's a guy, his name is Ora Anderson. And he was a newspaper editor for the Jackson Times, I think it was, Jackson, Ohio. And he became a conservationist. And there's a channel on YouTube. He's got a video where he talks about the forest being reborn in southern Ohio. Well, during the 1800s, when they were doing the iron industry, they were using charcoal for the iron forging, and they were clearing 30 acres of forest a day. Yeah. And they basically deforested all of southern Ohio during that time. I mean, it's hard to believe if you saw southern Ohio now, it's so wooded. But during that time, they completely deforested it for the iron industry. And then during the time of the Depression, the government bought up a lot of that land, those bare hills, and to create jobs, they paid people to plant trees. And that's how the forest came back. So I've often wondered, where did the Sasquatch go during that time? Did they go across the Ohio River to Kentucky, or over into West Virginia and Pennsylvania?
That's what they would have done. They would have got pushed out of those areas because of that. During colonial times, there was a great deal of logging went along on the East Coast as well, North Carolina in particular, but Pennsylvania and New York State, for the lumber was all being sent to Great Britain for shipbuilding, especially the masts. They needed really big white pine trees, nice and straight, and so they had a lot of those that were transported, but a lot of lumbering. And in fact, during that early colonial period, they did clear cut a lot of property there too that became
for farming,
farmland.
Yeah.
And so the Sasquatch would have gotten moved out of the area, but the farms that came in brought a different type of food source that the Sasquatch would have most likely taken advantage of. Things like corn, berry plants of all types, blackberries and blueberries and so forth. Maybe other types of things, maybe, sheep, chickens, all this kind of stuff now would have most likely been on the menu. which it wasn't when it was a forested area. So that shows that there's a possibility, in fact, that the Sasquatch has been able to adapt somewhat to some of the changes in his surrounding area. So that's interesting too, because the ability to adapt is something that a lot of animals can't do. They have specific foods, and when they can't get those foods, then they go extinct.
Well, that's like here in Western Ohio.
What's that?
Here in Western Ohio, that's pretty much, it's all farmland, and there's patches of woods that maybe there might be 100, 200 acres here and there, and 50 acres, a lot of patches of woods, but not a forest. And
Right.
they've learned there's been a lot of sightings on this side of the state, and it's been like out in the field or crossing the road. And I think they travel the waterways, the creeks and rivers, because they're wooded on both sides. Because there's a lot of houses that they're going close to, and I think they use that for cover. But
and of course I wrote about in my book too. They use other things like the power lines for ways to travel around without being seen so much. A lot of these high tension power lines go through wooded areas, and there's it's easy walking. Railroads are another one.
Right.
The border between Canada and the United States, that's a 100-foot wide path that's easy walking. All these type of things. The Appalachian Trail. These are all areas that it's very likely that they took advantage of them because they were such easy ways to move around and not to be seen necessarily. So,
yeah. The most recent sighting on the BFRO here in Ohio was on a bike path along the river.
So. Yeah. And of course, like you say, the rivers and streams, they follow those too. And so there again, they take advantage of the easy way to move around. And also depending on what they're eating too. And in what the Sasquatch may be eating in one area, a Sasquatch down near the coastline would be eating different foods. He might be eating shellfish and cat nine tails and other types of food that's a little more common along the shorelines. Mm-hmm. And up in the mountains where they're living, they may be eating more berries, nuts, and so their diets could be somewhat different depending on the location. So that's an interesting aspect too. It's most, I've been asked about it several times, and I kind of believe that there are more than one type of Sasquatch. I kind of compare it to the canine family, where you have your wolf, your coyote, and your red fox. They're all in the same family group, but they look a little bit different, and some of their food is a little bit different. But I think there may be as many as 3 different types of Sasquatch in North America. And that's there again, just an opinion, but based on, the sighting reports we get, some look very different than others. When we get drawings that people do, in my book, I have a number of artwork drawings done by different people who were kind enough to let me use some of their artwork, and I do some artwork myself, and I had that in my book as well. So you can see that they're not exactly looking the same.
Well, it's like the skunk ape in Florida. Most of their descriptions are they're tall and lean, thin,
right?
Not so massive like up north.
They're not so big as where they're a little bit taller, and they may be 500, 600, 700 pounds.
Yeah.
Up in Canada or northern part of the country, and so I think there's some differences there that may mean that they're slightly different, not all the same. But I talk about a lot of things in my book. I tried to touch on a number of things. A lot of my chapters are really short. They're just a couple pages, but I talk about a lot of things that could be connected to Sasquatch. Um, and people found that interesting because it kind of gets people thinking about it. I mean, that was the whole point of the book. I was trying to come out with something that was a little bit different. I didn't want to just have a book full of accounts. Um, I do have some accounts in there, but I didn't want the whole book to be that. I wanted it to be about
Right.
how the history of North America, as that changed, how that would have affected the Sasquatch.
Well,
That's what
in
I
our
tried to do in my book, and I think I was successful in that. And I tried to, I was looking at it from an educational point of view. I'm trying to get people to think a little bit, and then get involved with maybe research and be able to have a book that they could refer to as, well, here's where I got the idea from, and I've looked into that, and maybe they found out that it's not the case, or maybe they found out that, hey, this is really interesting. I never thought of that. So
well, in our conversations, I mentioned that book Enoch
yeah.
that Autumn Williams wrote, and one of the things I found really interesting in that book, Autumn Williams was she actually was on a show back in the 70s. I didn't remember watching that show back in the 70s, but she was on a TV show about Bigfoot back then. And she had met this guy named Mike, or at least that's the name she used for him, down in Florida, who was having some problems in his life, maybe with his wife. I don't know. They didn't go into detail, but he just wanted to get out on his own for a while. And he went out to an area of a swamp in Florida, really remote area, and camped there. And he ended up having this encounter and actually habituated it. And he named it Enoch. But one of the interesting things is he found out over time that they all of them from that area, well, not all of them, but a lot of them from that area in the wintertime would go to this one location out in the swamp, really hard to get to. And the theory was that the pregnant females would all go travel there. The whole family clan would go there, and the males would go out and look for food and everything, while all the females stayed there and took care of the young, the newborns. And they said that was a thing that Native Americans used to do, that they would come together, the tribes in that area would all come together and kind of help the females get through the winter while they'd go out and look for food and everything and take care of them. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting comparisons with the Native Americans.
Yeah.
The question is often which came first, the Sasquatch or the Native Americans. I mean, they talked about trading with Sasquatch. And the first thing you would ask, it's like, well, what do they got to trade? Well, they understood the herbs that the Native Americans use for medicine. And so they often traded those for, dried salmon or camas grass. Camas grass was a real big thing in British Columbia. It has a tuber on it that it's the Native Americans use as food, and it was next to dried salmon. It was the most traded food amongst tribes, so it was definitely a major food source. But that's what they would have traded, is these herbs. Now, how did the Sasquatch know what these herbs had medicinal purpose for them? And so did the Native Americans express that to them, or did they already have that knowledge from somewhere else and they brought it to the Native Americans? I mean, that's the question.
Yeah. Like the chicken and the egg question.
That's right. Yeah, which came first? Yeah.
Yeah. But, well, I mean, the Native Americans always referred to them as basically another tribe, a big brother.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And most of the Native American tribes have a word in their language that would mean wild man or some term that they would use to describe this Sasquatch or what we call now Bigfoot in their language. So they had a word there. So I mean, you're not going to have that unless there's the real deal. I mean, because they needed to speak amongst the tribe, so they needed to have a reference word to use towards what they were describing, and so that was the reason they had the word. So,
did you ever see the movie Last of the Dogmen?
No, I'm not a big follower of the Dogman. I've done a little bit of research, but
it's not the Dogman as in the cryptid. This is it's a movie about these two hunters up in Montana that went up there hunting in a really remote area, and they ended up they didn't come back, and they sent this detective up there to find out what happened to them. Well, he found their bodies. They'd been killed. They'd been killed by this Native American tribe that nobody knew existed way up in the mountains in Montana, and they called them the Dogmen, this tribe. So it's an interesting story because, I mean, it's basically that they've lived there all this time and nobody knew it because it was such a remote area.
Yeah, and it was probably a small group, so it's like there's not as many of them. They seem to be people who have seen or have groups living in their area. The groups aren't terribly large. They may be 5, 6, 8 individuals, but we're not talking 30 or 40 or anything like that. So.
Well, that was another thing about what I was talking about, how they would, in the winter, they would all travel to a known location where they would, the other purpose was for the younger females to find a mate that was outside of their immediate family area, where they wouldn't be inbred so much. It would be more finding a distant cousin or whatever.
Right. And that would be interesting too, because if we have to assume, I mean, based on the Native American language for a tribe like the Cherokee on the East Coast and a tribe in, say, British Columbia, the languages would be totally different. They wouldn't be able to communicate with each other based on words. They could use sign language and other things, but their language would be different. So if the Sasquatch is similar, then if these adolescents get out of their area to breed with a different Sasquatch from a different area, they're going to have, they each might have separate languages. And that would cause some kind of a crossover there. That could be very interesting. If that indeed is the fact, how that would affect that new family as it grew up, because they'd be dealing with two languages.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that Scott Nelson, I heard him talking about there was a woman from Ohio, over in Eastern Ohio, that got a recording of the chatter and sent it to Scott Nelson. And when he heard it, he showed it to Ron Moorhead, and Ron said he thought somehow she got a hold of one of his recordings.
Yeah,
and
I heard that too. Yep.
He went through all of them, and it didn't match any of them, and he realized it's just very similar sounding. But
yep, I remember hearing about that too. Yeah, that was pretty interesting. And
yeah.
It would have been nice if Ernie could have got a recording of what he heard of the chatter talk too. Then we could compare that with a lot of things. That would be really interesting.
Have you seen or not seen, but heard on Sasquatch Chronicles, the one with Claire from the UK? Have you heard that one?
I may have. I don't recognize it from. Maybe I would if I heard it.
Well, I think it's episode 515. I'm pretty sure. But she worked for a software company in the UK, and she was sent to California for a meeting, some kind of business meeting. and she had some time off, some downtime, and she just wanted to go out and see the scenery. She had her camera, and she went along the ocean there in California, and she was sitting there, and these Sasquatch come out of the forest into the ocean there, and she couldn't believe it. She was sitting there watching them, and then she wanted to try to get a picture because she had her camera there. Well, her lens came off, and the noise of it got their attention, and she said that she heard them doing a chatter talk back and forth, and the male, I guess, was really angry and pretty aggressive, and she was afraid it was going to harm her, and she thought the female might have calmed him down some, but she ended up passing out from fear. And when she came to, she was out by her car with her coat pulled up over her head, like she thought it must have drug her back to her car, basically. But
Yeah,
it's an interesting story.
Yeah, probably
Very
carried her. Yeah, most likely you would have
Yep.
picked it up and carried her probably. Yeah,
And
that's interesting. Yeah,
and of course, she called the authorities, and they told her it was a bear.
it was a bear. Yeah,
Yeah.
We get that all. If you don't know what it is, then that's the term they use. And,
Yeah.
it's like, but it's funny. But yeah, and then when you look, we have the Yeti in Nepal, and the Yeti is typically considered a little smaller than the North American Bigfoot, Sasquatch. The Russians have the Almasi. That one is also has some similarities to the Sasquatch, but tends to be a little smaller also, but maybe a little larger than the Yeti. But the Russians have done quite a lot of work on them too. There's a couple of really good papers out there with a lot of detailed information from farmers that live on the outskirts of these wilderness areas, and they see these Amasi come into their area, and they actually see them eating certain things, certain types of foods, and so actually see them put it in their mouth and eat it. That's something you don't hear about in accounts very often.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings up an interesting account too that Mary Green had in her book, which I found very fascinating. She put a brown paper bag and filled it with popcorn and threw a piece of string up over a tree branch and attached it to the bag and lifted it up about approximately 10 feet off the ground. So she came back a couple days later, and the bag was still hanging in the tree, but the bottom of the bag was punched full of holes. And the popcorn, there were remnants of it still on the ground. They had eaten quite a lot of it, but some of the pieces were still on the ground. And when she looked around, she found a stick that was quite long. And she surmised that they took that stick and poked the bag. And when they made holes in it, the popcorn fell out. So the interesting thing about this is Mary Green spoke to a woman, another researcher, a friend of hers in Arkansas. And she did the same thing. She put the brown paper bag and hung it up in the tree. And lo and behold, the same thing happened. They used a stick and punched holes in the bottom of the bag so that the popcorn fell out on the ground. Now, Mary Green did it in Tennessee. So between Tennessee and Arkansas, that's quite a ways apart to have the similar behavior. And so the question is, why did they do that? Well, and one of the things that I talked about in my book, I mentioned it, that it's possible that they might have considered that was a bee's nest of some kind. And the reason they used the stick was they poked it, obviously, because they thought it was a bee's nest. So, and then when they realized that it made holes and the popcorn fell out, then they went and got it and ate it. But that's kind of the theory that I have, that they may have considered that a bee's nest. And that's why it happened in two different parts of the country. So,
I mentioned Randy Harrington earlier. Out there, they call it the 400, the area that they do their research. They have found holes with a stick that's still in it. They think it's probably a juvenile, possibly, but they don't know the purpose, but they have found several times where there's been a hole dug and the stick is still in it. So that was kind of interesting.
There's a lot of interesting stuff out there when you want to take these accounts seriously that people come up with. If you can get the people to talk to you about them. I spoke at the Virginia Bigfoot Conference in 2016, and I had a number of people come up to me and talk to me about sightings and accounts they had that were it's stuff that's never been written down anywhere, and there were some really good reports and really interesting ones.
Yeah.
And so you gather these little tidbits of information, and then look for similarities with other accounts. And like this one with the popcorn in the bag. I mean, that's pretty interesting and amazing that so far apart that the same behavior pattern would be used, and what was the reason for it. So, but that's all part of the research. I mean, that you try to do is gather this information as best we can, and try to get it written down or get a file made or something, so that when you see something else, you can add it to the file and keep it. It's like, here's the same thing happening somewhere else.
Yeah,
And
I've got things in my head from listening to so many, and I try to find where they overlap. But like you said, it's hard I don't remember where I heard this or that, and I try to.
Right. Yeah, you got to have that stuff written down, because then you can go through and try to remember. It's like, no, I remember hearing that somewhere, and you look through your notes, and hopefully you can find the notes, but and then you can add the two together, and maybe you get a third one later on, and so all that information then becomes pretty valuable, because obviously the more times that you hear about it, the more likely it's a good piece of information. So
I remember hearing one time, and I don't remember where, but I remember hearing a guy talking about gifting them with food, and that they really did not like cabbage, which I thought was interesting. I just wonder if you've come across that anywhere, but
I haven't heard that before. No, I'm not a huge fan of gifting to them, not food anyway. I think you're better off to gift other things.
I think so too. I think that you froze up, Russell. Hopefully you'll come back here shortly. Been a really good conversation. Good getting some of his knowledge. He's done a lot of research. So hopefully he'll come back. While we're waiting for him, I just want to bring up his book again. Let me share that real quick. Right here. This is the book that he wrote. And like he said, he goes into a lot of historical references in the book about the Native American history. And I haven't actually had a chance to get the book myself yet, but I do want to get it and read it. Let me see if I can make this a little bigger. There we go. So that's the book, Searching for Sasquatch, with historical observations and interpretations. He's a scholar when it comes to Sasquatch. He's done a lot of research, like he said, with the Hudson Bay, clear back to the 1600s. A lot of the fur traders, trappers that would trade with the Native Americans, and there's things to be found in those historical references regarding Sasquatch. You just got to really look. It's a lot of time searching. I know I've done a lot of searching myself in the Library of Congress there's a lot of you can't look for Bigfoot or Sasquatch. You got to look for wild man, hairy man, things like that. You have to try to find the right words to search for, because back then they didn't know what to call them, and they didn't call them Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Bigfoot came about in '58, I believe, when uh, Jerry Crew had a construction company building a logging road. It was in '58 in Northern California, and Russell's back. Here we go.
Yep, I got cut off.
That's
I
all
get
right.
bumped
I
off my
figured
internet sometimes.
I was just stalling for you, and I was talking about your book a little bit while you were gone. But
Oh, perfect. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I think people. It'll touch a wide range of interests amongst people. So, if you haven't seen one of my books, take a chance, because
yes,
it's definitely interesting. You'll find some definitely useful information in there, and it's certainly it's an educational tool that you'll be happy that you have to as a reference.
yeah, yeah. I was talking about how when, like, the Library of Congress, I go there and do a lot of searching, and I was saying you can't search for Bigfoot or Sasquatch. You got to look for like hairy man or
That's
wild
right.
man or things like that to
Yeah.
find any references.
Yeah, because the further back you go, the more likely, the less you hear of Bigfoot and Sasquatch. I mean, Bigfoot didn't come about until the
58. Yeah.
Jerry Crew, came up with that, the newspaper
Right.
account. So it wasn't, it's not that old. Sasquatch, the name Sasquatch goes back to the 20s. I mean, we see that referenced in Albert Osterman's account, the Native American that took him back into the area where he was kidnapped by the Sasquatch, spoke of and used the term Sasquatch. So it's like it may go back further than that, but that's one of the places that you see it used. But
Well, I wanted to go back to Mary Green, because I found very little on her on YouTube. I found a few interviews that are really short. I found a
yeah,
lot about Janice Carter, and I know they were friends, but yeah, I don't know much about Mary Green. So maybe you could give us some more information about her.
well, Mary Green is very interesting. She started out as a non-believer, and then she, over the years, she became more realizing that these things were real and that they were out there, and they allowed her to see them, and so forth. She wrote two books early on that she just did herself, and then later on she did a book with Janice Carter. Her books are very hard to find. They're quite pricey if you do find them. But I'm fortunate that I have both of her early books, and that describes a lot of her life, where she has life experiences with these Sasquatch, and she doesn't even realize that's what it is at
In
the
Tennessee.
time. But then, as she looked back on it, as she continued to take notes and started being a researcher, she realized that some of these things that happened to her early on in her life was related to the Sasquatch. So that makes her book kind of interesting, because just from that aspect of a non-believer, then to become a researcher who did some really good research and tried some innovative things, and she documented that in her book.
It's like the hunter who says, "Well, I've been in the woods all my life and I never seen anything," and then the one day he has that encounter, and then he starts going back to all those times where something happened that he's like, "Wait a minute, I wonder if that was one of these things."
That's exactly right. Yep, that's exactly what happens. Or you hear some sound that you're not familiar with out there in the woods, and then later on you see one of these things making that sound. It's like, holy cow, that's what I heard years ago, but I didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
Or whatever. But Yep, there's a lot of those instances with the Sasquatch. That's for sure.
I was watching an interview today. Well, not an interview, but it was Janice Carter. It was somebody who had invited her to their property,
Hmm.
and she never been there before. And she goes there, and they were just taking a walk through the woods, and she found a tree structure basically, and she said, "This is a water sign." And she went over and was looking at it, and she said, "There's a spring this way. There's a spring over here." And she's never been there before, and they're like, "You're right. There is a spring over there, and yeah, there's a neighbor. Our neighbor has a spring right down that way." And so, I mean, she recognized somehow. It
Yep,
didn't look like much to me, but she recognized as soon as she saw it.
yep. And I've listened to Janet a few times too, and yeah, a lot of her stuff is very interesting because she had a lot of accounts of things that happened that were indeed sounded very credible
Yeah, yeah,
and were very good. I know she and Mary Green wrote a book together on that. I think it's called 50 Years with Sasquatch or something like
yeah.
that. I don't have that particular book because I haven't been able to locate it, um, but they did. They worked together on that, and then Mary Green passed away. And I think there's been some talk of Janice trying to get that book republished because it's out of print, and because it would certainly be uh, very helpful for researchers to have. I have a copy of that. You can go online and see the book is broken down by chapters, and you can actually listen to each chapter if you go through the whole thing on the internet. But to have the book on hand is nice, like any book, because you can refer back to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I found, I don't remember where it was on YouTube. It was like 8 parts, and it was an interview of Janice Carter.
Mhm.
And she goes through the whole growing up with her grandfather and Fox, the one
Right.
she called Fox. And I found her to be very credible because, I mean, she goes into a lot of detail, and she's never like stopping and going, I mean, she just rattles one detail off after another. She doesn't have to think about it. So I found her to be really credible. I mean, the stuff she says is hard to believe, but I believe her.
Yeah, yeah, and there again, I'm kind of the same way. I think there was a few things that Mary Green didn't necessarily agree with the way Janice expressed it, but for the most part, I think that they their information was credible um, and definitely helpful for research for sure. So
Well,
um,
one thing I found interesting was with Janice, and I don't remember exactly how she worded it, but I remember she said it a couple times, something about around the edge of their head there was like a line or something around their. I don't know if you ever heard her talk about that, but she was
I
talking
don't
about
remember.
their
I don't
facial
remember it right
features.
offhand.
Yeah, there was something about the way their head around the edge of their head that she I made heard her make reference to it a couple times. So I thought
Hmm.
that was interesting. I'll have to listen to it again because I don't remember
Yeah, and
exactly
she talks
how
about
she
there
worded
was
it.
one in particular that was a dark colored one that was very different from the others. It was very aggressive.
Right, the one she was afraid of. Yeah.
Yeah, she was afraid of. Apparently, it hurt a little girl or something, and
Hmm.
there was some other things that went on with this particular one that she felt was very aggressive and was unlike the other ones that they did have that Mary Green knew about and Janice talks about. So that's interesting that it was so different um, to
Well,
have
the
one
other
that was.
thing that I thought was interesting is how she said that the one wore that shirt until it was worn out. Like it
Oh yeah,
really liked having that T-shirt.
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
Mary Green talks about one that had a cloak of some kind. It wore it like a cloak over its shoulders, and it didn't wear it all the time. But I don't know, not sure what it was. It was like an old blanket or something, um, but did occasionally was seen wearing it.
Well, I think
Of course,
Janice. Janice talked about her dad. I think it was her dad or her grandfather. Maybe it was her grandfather. Had somehow come across these bib overalls that belonged to Haystack Calhoun.
Yep.
Yeah, and gave it to Fox to wear.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember hearing that too. Yep. Yep. And Mary Green was actually there went to see Fox when Fox was um, very sick. They thought maybe he was on his deathbed. She went with some other people back to an encampment, and there was a small group of them there. But Fox was had something. She called it. She thought it looked like gout or something with his foot, but his foot was, I guess, bleeding, and um, there was something there that had happened. Now it could have been a snake bite or something that would have caused swelling or something, and
Yeah.
who knows? But that she described that as part of what was bothering him at the time that they went to visit him, and they took him some tobacco because he liked to chew in tobacco, and there was other couple other things that they took to give to him, and that was the last time they ever saw him. So he must have passed away after that, Fox. But
Could have been a snake bite.
it could have been.
Could have been. Yeah.
Yeah, if it was a rattlesnake, it most likely. A copperhead probably not as potent, but
Right.
rattlesnake might have been. And there again, your foot is your leg. That's typically where you get a bite. So that could have been and that would have caused some real swelling. And actually, the skin actually breaks. It swells so much. So it's certainly a possibility.
Yeah.
Mary Green described it as looking like a severe case of gout. That's what she described it as. But
There's in that book Enoch. There's an instance where he was at the swamp, and he always had a pistol on his side. Just whenever he went in the swamp, he always had it. And he said at one point they were at the camp, and that Enoch shoved him backward, almost fell down, and he didn't understand why. Just out of the blue, that he would do that to him, and he saw him look over, and he noticed there was a snake there under this log, and he was getting ready to step right there, poisonous snake. So his immediate reaction was to grab his pistol to shoot the snake, and when he reached for his pistol, Enoch reacted because he obviously knew it was a gun,
right.
And he realized when he reacted. So then he grabbed the axe and killed the snake with the axe. But
yeah, I have an account of that. An interesting account of that. Similar type of thing. There were two children that this single mom and these two children were in a car, and they stopped alongside of a roadway at a picnic table to have lunch. And the kids got out, and they were climbing up in a small apple tree that was right near the picnic table. Well, while mom was getting food out of the car and putting it on the picnic table, she looked over, and the kids started yelling. And when she looked over, she could see this Sasquatch coming out of the woods towards her kids. So she immediately starts, heading over towards the apple tree. I don't know how far it was away from the picnic table, maybe 40 feet or 50, 60 feet or something. I don't know the exact measurement, but But she went headed over there, and by that time the Sasquatch had already got there and reached down, and she said he picked up a stick off the ground and threw it off to the left, turned around, and walked back the way he came. So when she got down there, she sees the Sasquatch walking away, and she's getting her kids out of the tree to go back to the picnic table, and she looks over at the stick, and the stick was indeed a snake of some sort. She didn't know what kind it was, but it was a snake. It wasn't a stick. So that was a similar account to what you were just talking about, where the Sasquatch, he knew the snake was there, and maybe it was a poisonous one that might have bitten the kids, and that's why he did what he did.
Well, I do remember hearing also a story, and I don't remember where I read this, but it was a boy in Florida that was playing in the woods there by his house, and he got bit by a rattlesnake. Stepped over a log, and the snake got him. And he was only like 7 years old, I think, something like that, 7 or 8 years old. But the mother found him laying on the front porch. He was unconscious, and she got him to the hospital, and he recovered. You know, they got him the antivenom and everything. And she said, "How did you get there on the porch?" And he said a bear picked him up and carried him.
Yep. Yep. There's the bear again. Yep. There's
Yeah,
a number of accounts like that. There's a pretty famous account. I believe it's in, I don't remember right offhand. I believe it's in New Hampshire, where a little girl got lost, and she said a bear came by and picked her up and brought her back to where her parents were looking for her and dropped her off. But she's very specific that a bear picked her up.
yeah. Because I mean, what else would she? All she
Right.
knows is big and hairy like that.
That's right, right. She wouldn't have anything other to reference it to. She'd never seen a
Yeah,
Sasquatch before, so
right.
she just assumed it's a bear. So,
Yeah.
uh, yeah, and that's a pretty well-known account, as I remember. I don't remember the particulars of it, but it is an interesting one. I'm pretty sure it's in New Hampshire. But,
I think I remember hearing that. Wasn't she gone for like 3 days or something?
yeah, it was. Yeah, it was more than a day. Yeah, because it
Yeah.
was overnight, and they brought some other people in to help look for the girl too. It was something like that happened in North Carolina too. That was a little boy or something and they ended up finding him eventually. But he said something about that the bear slept with him at night and stayed with him um, because it was pretty chilly. I guess it was in the 30s at night. Um, but the bear was gone when they actually found the little boy. But I believe that was
Hmm.
in North Carolina too. But
Yeah, it's interesting to hear those kind of stories.
yeah, and it's pretty amazing when you hear one like that, and then you have another one on file. It's like, hey, that's kind of similar to this, So you put them together and
It's
archive
not like
that, and then you get another account. So
it's not like a little child would make that up. It's just
that's right. Yeah,
they're just giving it from their own understanding.
yeah, and the reference to the bear is, perfectly acceptable for what they would know about. So
Hmm.
yeah. All that
Yeah,
information is interesting to gather, and then you try to get it written down or something. And when I did my book, I tried to put a lot of those things in, and there again, there are a lot of short chapters in there, but they talk about some of these small little things, and when you put two and two together and you keep adding this stuff up, it starts showing a picture of what we're dealing with here. Um,
yeah. Well, I mean, we've got so many reports of eyewitness reports from the East Coast to the West Coast,
yep,
and all the descriptions are almost identical. I mean, there's very little
yep.
differences.
Yep. They're always tall. They're always muscular. Um, there's certain things I look for. I always look for the trapezius muscle and where the attachment is. I mean, that's why they often are described as not having any neck
Hmm.
because the muscle, because their shoulders are so far apart and they're so muscular, that trapezius muscle has to have the attachment has to be up higher, up below, up near the ear somewhere is where the attachment to that muscle has to be, and to go out onto the shoulder, and then to support all that weight of the shoulder and the arm. So it's it's got to be that way in order to be anatomically correct, to support the weight that they have, because their shoulders are so broad and they're so muscular, too. That's the
No,
other thing you always hear about them. Very, very fit looking.
it's like Lou Ferrigno, the Hulk.
That's
He didn't
right.
look like he had much of a neck.
That's right. Because they had that trapezius muscle. They
Yeah,
work it so it just gets larger. But with the Sasquatch, it's actually an attachment where it's up on the neck, up higher than what the human has. So our
yeah,
shoulders obviously aren't as wide, or our arms aren't as heavy. Their
Well, it's
arms are
like,
so muscular and they're so long. The ability of leverage that they have in those arms is the amount of strength is tremendous, for sure.
yeah, it's like I'm sure you've probably seen it. The one, I think it was a logging group of loggers that came in work in the morning and saw one, and the guy got it with his cell phone, and it picked up a tree, and the tree looks like it's 20 some feet long, and throws it one handed.
Yep.
Throws it pretty good ways.
Yep.
So don't think that's a guy in a suit.
Yeah. Thinker Thunker did a really good, interesting one on the Utah sighting, where they actually saw the supposed Sasquatch picks up a stone, a rock, and throws it kind of sidearm, but it shows how he picks it up and turns his body as he throws it. He doesn't throw it overhand, or in this case, he doesn't throw it underhand, but it's kind of sidearm. And it actually shows the throwing process. And you can see how long the arm is and how the leverage that it has there. And it was able to throw this rock quite a distance. He did a very nice job on that. I put that in my book as well, a reference to the work he did on that, because it was so interesting, because you don't often see, how they throw something.
Well, he actually did a video on the one I'm talking about also with the tree.
Yep. I saw that one. Yep.
Yeah, did a really good job because he used a wood weight calculator based that lumber used for lumber work, and also he showed the strongman competition where they were taking a 50-pound weight and trying to throw it, and the difference. I mean, these big bulky guys that can barely throw it 10 feet, and this thing chucks a tree.
Yeah, and how they throw it. I mean, they throw it kind of sidearmed as well. So
right,
that's what they're able to do. So it's pretty interesting. He does a lot of interesting research and on various accounts, and he's definitely a good guy to listen to.
Yeah, I like his analysis on a lot of stuff.
He does a really good job. Yeah, I reference that one in my book. So,
what do you think about the Minnesota Iceman?
I don't know. It's an interesting one. It's hard to because you don't. It's sort of disappeared if recollection serves.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what happened to it or where it went, but it's definitely interesting.
It'd be nice to actually see it in person.
Yeah, it has its arm kind of up across its head or something, as I remember, and and its arm doesn't look quite as big, but there again, being frozen, would have certain effects on your body. So, it's hard to know what it looked like before it was frozen, but it was interesting. It's too bad it disappeared. Sounds like the Smithsonian.
Exactly.
Yeah. Some of the giant bones that they were documenting and doing so much work on from burial mounds, and now all of a sudden they have no clue where that information is or when.
What are you talking about? Don't know nothing about that.
We don't know. Yeah. Well, you're the one that we have it documented. You wrote it down.
Yeah. It's kind of like that last scene in Indiana Jones where they put the Ark of the Covenant up on that shelf in the warehouse. And
exactly like that. Yeah. They know it's in the warehouse, but they don't know where it is, or they don't want to look or don't want to, say that they know where it is. So.
Or they sold it to some billionaire for his private collection or something.
Right. Yeah. That's the story behind the Smithsonian. That's for sure. So.
Yeah, it seemed like there was something else I was going to ask you about. There was I mentioned the Iceman. What was the other thing? I just left my mind while we were talking.
It'll come back. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
can't
talk
remember what
about
it was.
in my book forest fires, how those affect Sasquatch. You know, when I worked with the North Carolina Forest Service, I worked on some forest fires. I was a
Yeah,
chainsaw operator cutting fire lanes and stuff, and it's pretty amazing the animals that you do see that are being chased by the fire. The fire moves about as fast as you can walk, so you know the animals had to stay on top of it to stay ahead of it, and you see a lot of stuff. Pretty amazing. I never saw a Sasquatch, but
right. Well,
amazing.
Mount St. Helens,
Yes, Mount St.
that
Helens.
story. Yeah,
Yep, yep, for sure. I mean, we know it sure seems like there's a lot of accounts, Mount St. Helens, that the wild man is up there. And certainly a number of them would have been destroyed during that eruption. So, you know, the question is always how many, and, you know, it would have to be based upon, you know, the area that the mountain would support them with food and so forth. You know, you can't say that there was 50 or 100 of them killed because the mountain couldn't support that many of them. So with the food supply, so you know the number had to be a more reasonable number. You know, but you know we don't know exactly, but certainly they would certainly make sense that they would have been a certain amount of them would have been destroyed. So
well, there's that story that they supposedly rescued one that was burnt
yep,
from the
yep, I heard
eruption.
that. Yep, they took
Yeah,
it away pretty quickly. They got it out of there. Um, yep.
I
So I don't
I don't know
know.
if you ever did you ever see. It's called, I think it's called Skunk Ape Lives. It was in Tracy Brown down in Florida. Did it as a documentary. I don't know
Okay,
if you've
yeah,
seen
I
it.
know. I've heard Tracy Brown's name before. Yep.
He's the one that got that really good thermal. It's like a black and white thermal, but
Okay.
you could see it. You could see it running the long arms. It's a really good quality. One of the best thermals I think I've seen.
Yeah,
But
there's a good thermal out there in the uh, Mike Green. He's passed away now, but it was in the Uray National Forest in North Carolina, where he gets him. He picks a candy bar up off the
oh
stump,
yeah,
and
and it crawls up.
yep, you
Yeah,
can see him. He squats down, then you can see his arm come out, and he reaches out and gets the candy bar and brings it back. Then you see
yeah,
him stand up, and he's looking at the camera. He knows the camera is there. He's eating the candy bar, and he's looking around the tree, and then he swings out, and he looks again, and then he turns around and walks away. So that's a pretty interesting piece of film too.
yeah. Well, the
Yeah.
reason I brought up the Skunk Ape Lives is he interviews a forest ranger or a wildlife officer. It was in the Everglades, and they had a wildfire breakout, and it was him and another his partner were in their truck, and they were sent down this road to look for animals that had come out of the forest that might have been hurt from this wildfire.
Mm-hmm.
And as they're going down the road looking, something ran out in front of them, and they hit it and killed it. And they thought it was a bear until they got out and got a better look at it, and it looked human, except
Wow.
covered with hair. And they reported it, and they told them to come back to the office immediately. So they turn around and drive back, and they're examining the truck when they get there, looking at the truck and asking them all these questions and everything. And then they send another team to go in there and get whatever it was,
Right.
and they're told they're not supposed to discuss it ever, or they might lose their pension. Of
Yeah.
course, he's doing it, discreetly. He's not showing his face, or his voice is disguised, but
Right. Yeah. The Forest Service, when I worked for them, was the same way. You know, it was we spoke amongst ourselves about it occasionally, more tongue in cheek than anything else. But you were pretty much told you weren't going to say too much about anything like that um, if you wanted to keep your job.
Did they make you sign an NDA or just?
No, you didn't have to. I never signed anything, but
Yeah,
it was just kind of unspoken. It was spoken, but unspoken.
right,
So,
right. Made
yeah,
sure
it
you're
was the
aware of
same.
it.
It would be the same if you were talking about a UFO or something. They weren't keen on that either. So
Yeah.
anything that might disturb the people coming to the park or something, they didn't want to do anything like that. So
Hmm. And if anybody sees something, it was a bear.
you're right, it's a bear.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I'm sure that a lot of logging crews have had to have encounters
Yeah,
because I
you
would
would
think,
think so. Yeah, you would think
yeah,
so. And I think that there's other people. I often think of Calvin Rutstrom. He was a pretty well known. He wrote a number of books on living in the wilderness and living with the Cree Indians, and he's a pretty interesting guy. He was into canoeing and stuff, but he never speaks of Sasquatch or anything like that in any of his books that I'm aware of. And you have to think that, I mean, he was out camping alone by himself a lot, but you would think he would hear something or that he couldn't recognize or the sound or something. You would think there would be some reference, but there isn't. There's a number of people like that. Back in there again, it was the 30s that were trappers and stuff that were out and living in the wilderness areas of Minnesota
hmm
or Canada and so forth, but no description of anything like a Sasquatch.
well, like Lewis and Clark, you would
Yes,
think they would
yeah,
have.
yeah, that was pretty amazing as far as they went. You would think that, I mean, we know those Indian tribes had a word in their language for that. It's like, why didn't Lewis and Clark, speak of it in some manner? It seems like they would have had an account or something.
Well,
There,
unless it was like a face to face, they might have dismissed it as, oh, that must have been a bear, or maybe my mind's playing tricks on me. They're not going to describe something if they can't really explain it because people will
that's right. They'll
laugh at them
question.
or whatever. Yeah.
And my understanding too that there were some journals from the Lewis and Clark expedition that are missing,
Hmm.
and there's a section of time period that was written down according to the report from the expedition, but Thomas Jefferson didn't have them or couldn't find them or something. There was something strange about that, where there was a few of those reports, and I often wonder if there was some mention in those missing reports that Thomas Jefferson didn't feel was advantageous to people wanting to establish homesteads in that area. So um, could have came up
Because
missing at who knows, but
didn't they give like a pretty good description of the grizzly the first time they saw one?
what's that?
Didn't they in the Lewis and Clark? Didn't they give a pretty detailed description of a grizzly the first time they encountered one?
Yeah, I believe there was. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And see, Thomas Jefferson was looking for an account of the woolly mammoth. That's what he was hoping they would see. Is
Oh,
that, and they didn't have anything to report on about that too. But that was another thing that came up that Thomas Jefferson was hoping they would find, but there was no reference to anything like that. But yep, they had a grizzly bear, and of course they met a number of different Native American tribes when they were out there, and so it is kind of amazing that there was no mention of that. So for as
yeah.
as detailed account of that expedition as there was, you would think there might be some mention.
Well, I know, especially now. I believe they know when they see a gun. They know what a gun is,
Yeah,
and I think that's why a lot of hunters say, they've never seen anything because they're carrying a gun. So they know to stay hid. So I don't know if back then they would have necessarily known if they saw a gun, but maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, it's certainly possible, and they're obviously very
Or
intelligent. So it's like they're quick to learn, a quick learner, and it would seem they adapt pretty well if there's a change in their environment or something. So that takes a
or
intelligent
right.
creature to be able to make all those things work for them. So
It's possible too that they had learned from Native Americans that the white man carries a disease that could kill them off. So they
yeah, it's
learned to stay
possible.
away from them.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
possible, and they may have actually contracted the disease. Who knows? And if they did, we don't know how it affected them if they had got it, but they certainly could have been. It could have had an effect on their population in particularly certain areas. I was thinking of British Columbia in particular. That particular area was really hit hard with the smallpox early on when the Spanish and the English were there. They brought diseases in, and it just about wiped out some of those tribes. Yeah,
And it's possible during the Trail of Tears that some
yep,
was brought to Oklahoma too.
yep, absolutely. Yep,
Yeah.
could have very well been. Yep, but yep. So I touched upon that in my book as well. I also touched on fibrinosis. That's another um, a disease where that Sasquatch may have contracted. It's certainly possible. You see it with white-tailed deer. They have this tumors on them, and the tumors grow, and they can grow around their mouth or their eyes.
I think we lost him again. Froze up. Hopefully he'll be right back. We get back to where he was left off. It's really interesting to hear some of the things he has to say. It's really enjoyable to talk to somebody that's so knowledgeable. So I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. I'll go back to what I was saying about Jerry Crew. If you're not familiar with that whole story, he was building a logging road in Northern California in 1958. And when they came in, I think it was after the weekend, they came into work and found these footprints all over the work site, and things had been disturbed. A lot of the machinery had been moved around and things, and they were missing like a 50-gallon drum of diesel. I think it was maybe hydraulic oil or diesel fuel, one or the other. 50-gallon drum, it weighed over 400 pounds, and it was missing. And they found it over in this ravine down in the creek, and something had picked it up and carried it all that way and thrown it. So a guy came from the newspaper, the local paper, did a story about it, and he said it was something with a big foot, and that's basically where the term Bigfoot came about. So,
Yeah,
okay, he's back.
I get bumped off, so it's like
you were talking about, is it fibrinosis or what was it
fibrinosis.
you
Yeah,
said? Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
They get those tumors, and the tumors go away after a certain period of time, and there's no ill effect to the animal unless it's around their mouth, so they can't eat, or around their eyes, so they can't see, and they become prey animals. But it's possible that the Sasquatch could, in fact, get that disease because they do prey on the deer that would have been sick with it, and that's how it's transmitted. So I wrote about that in my book. There's one of the universities did a big study on it, and I used some of their information in my book to talk about that possibility. I wrote a small article on that as well for Bigfoot Magazine. So that's
What do
just
you think about Bossberg, the Bossberg prints? You from? Do you think that you know what I'm talking about? The Bossberg trackway. It was they called it the cripple foot.
Oh yes, the
Well,
cripple foot. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, I know that term. Yep. Yep. That's an
I'm
interesting one too, with the damage to the foot, and
possible bear trap, maybe
right, right, could have been something like that to cause it, um,
snake
or
bite,
some
like
other
you
kind
said,
of a injury. Yep.
right?
Yep.
Well, what I was going to say is, have you come across very many instances of a foot like with four toes or three toes that it could possibly be from inbreeding? Have you ever heard of anything like that?
Um, I've heard of some accounts of that, but I've never seen anything like that. So,
Well, the
um,
reason I'm asking is because out where we go, a lot of times it's called Salt Fork. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in Ohio, it's the largest state park in Ohio, and
yeah,
it's
I
supposed
know.
to
Yeah,
it's where they have the conference, the Ohio Bigfoot Conference. But
right,
it's
right. Yeah.
been a lot of sightings over in that area. Anyway, I came across this footprint in the woods, and I wasn't sure if it was a footprint when I saw it. I mean, it looked like one, but there was only a big toe. I didn't see any other toe prints, just the one big toe.
Wow.
But so I thought, well, that's odd, and I took some pictures of it. And but I thought I really didn't even mention it. I just something I took pictures of and kept it in my head. Well, then this friend of mine found in a totally different area out there a really clear print in the mud with one big toe. So
Wow.
I'm thinking it was the same creature that I got saw the print from. And
Right.
then
Probably. Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting. Well, then I came across a guy out in Washington State that found a print that looks pretty much identical. It has the
Wow.
one toe. So
Wow.
then it got me thinking, is this possibly caused by inbreeding or is it from an injury or
Right. It could be in breeding that shows up in the feet sometimes. So that certainly is a possibility. It could be an injury of
yeah,
sort too. Um,
yeah,
but I would tend to think it's more likely a birth defect, probably that the other toes weren't formed, or if they were formed, they were a solid piece instead of being individual toes. Um, so it would make the track look just with the one big toe. I have a real good plastic cast of one that has a really large big toe, which is it's a big track too. It's about 18 and a half inches. Came from
wow.
Canada. Um, but yeah, that's one of the best tracks I have. Yep, that's interesting though.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye out when I'm out there for that because like I said, I think it was the same individual in both places. They were probably like
Yep.
5 miles apart, which is not far at all for
Right, that's
something
not
that
far
has
at all. I would
right.
expect these things could travel 200, 400 miles and certainly be within a respectable range if you found some particular footprint that was the same in both areas. 400 miles isn't very far for these creatures to move around. And
Right. Especially with a 6 foot stride and walking
yep,
the the where the power lines are or old
right.
railroad
Easy
tracks,
places to
something like that.
walk.
Yeah.
Yep, yep.
Did you have
Well,
anything
I
else
think
you wanted to talk about, or
I can't think of anything right offhand. There's probably a lot, but it's like
I
um,
know I'm probably going to think of whatever it was after we get done. So I was
yeah.
trying to
Well,
remember what it was,
I can
but
come on again sometime and we can
I'd
talk
love to.
about some other things. And
Well, one thing I'll bring up: did you have a chance to read through what I sent you there right before the show or shortly before about the? Let me pull it up
Oh,
here. I got the.
I didn't look at it in detail. Yeah.
I'll bring it up right here. Let's see. I'll pull it up on here. It's from the 1600s, I believe. But what I thought was interesting is they talk about a tribe of hairy people that lived along the river in Tennessee. That's what I thought was interesting. I don't know if it's probably too small for you to even see it.
Okay, yeah. I read what you wrote, but I didn't read this. I hadn't looked at this yet.
Yeah, it's a journeys of James Needham and Gabriel Arthur in 1673 and 1674, going through the Piedmont and mountains of North Carolina to establish trade with the Cherokee. That's what this little writing is about. It's probably about 3 pages, 2 or 3 pages, but it's interesting. It just talks about the tribes that they encountered, and
that's really cool. Yeah,
I'll
look at that and I'll print that off because I don't think I have that. I don't think I've seen.
It's interesting because they mention that tribe of hairy people, like, it's just, well, there was this one group of hairy people that lived along the river. And that's all they say about it.
Yep. Yeah, that's specific. I mean, they're hairy people. I mean, because the Native Americans they didn't have hair on they didn't have a beard or anything like that. So,
well, here, let me read that. Let me read that one paragraph because it also mentions another tribe. And let me read them together. It says, 8 days' journey down this river lives a white people who have long beards and whiskers and wear clothing. Now, see, that part is what really I thought was interesting. They make that distinction. They have long beards, whiskers, and they wear clothing, and they're white people. And on some of the other rivers live a hairy people. Not many years. So it's kind of interesting. They make the distinction. This one group wears clothes, and then on this other part of the river, there lives a hairy people.
Just a hairy people. Yeah.
You would think that means that these people don't wear clothes. That's the way I would interpret it.
Yeah, that's what you would. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, that's interesting. I'll pull that up and print that off. So I'll get that in my record. So that looks pretty interesting.
Maybe you can find some more detail from just that little bit right there.
Right. You might find something else that might lead you to something else that's helpful. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the way stuff goes when you're researching. Sometimes you find something and sometimes you just stumble onto something that's interesting, that you're not even looking for. But anyway, that's great. Thank you. And thank you for having me on your show. I appreciate it. And,
I've really enjoyed it. And we'll have to do another one at another time, maybe.
Yep. Certainly we do it again sometime.
Some other topics.
Yep. We can talk about the topics ahead of time and I can be prepared with some notes. Yep. And,
okay.
Yep.
It sounds
great.
Be
fun. That would be
I've
fun.
really enjoyed it, Russell. I was saying while you were gone how nice it is to talk to somebody who's really knowledgeable about a lot of these things. It's really refreshing to have a conversation like this.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear from other people too, and hear what they've seen and what they've reported and so forth. So yeah, for sure. But
I've enjoyed it immensely, Russell, and we'll set up another time to come back and do it again.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you very much for having me on. I'm sorry I got knocked off a couple times, but
that's okay.
My internet that happens sometimes. So
let me put the plug in for you. You're going to be on the Not So Perfect Bigfoot show.
Yeah, at some point. I haven't got the date yet, but Victoria Jackson is going to have me on her show, or she asked me to be on. So, but I don't know when it's going to be yet. But yeah, I'll be on that one.
Keep an eye out for that.
Yep.
All right. We'll sign off for now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.